In 2009, Research in Motion controlled nearly 50% of the United States smartphone market. They held the definitive monopoly on corporate communication, dictating terms to global carriers and government intelligence agencies alike. Yet within 5 short years, the company that literally addicted Wall Street to mobile email would be functionally dead. This was not a slow fade into obsolescence. It was a spectacular, self-inflicted decapitation by a leadership team that mistook a temporary hardware advantage for an eternal law of physics. The foundation of this empire was built on an unbreakable promise to enterprise IT departments. A BlackBerry was not a toy for the masses. It was a secure, encrypted vault that happened to fit in a tailored suit pocket. Network efficiency was their religion. The physical QWERTY keyboard was their holy artifact. They owned the boardroom because they bypassed the consumer entirely, selling fleets of devices directly to chief information officers who prioritized data security over user experience. At the top of this fortress sat a highly unusual executive structure. Mike Lazaridis was the engineering savant, a man obsessed with bandwidth optimization and battery life. Jim Balsillie was the ruthless corporate street fighter, the negotiator who bullied telecom operators into paying exorbitant monthly service fees just to access the proprietary network. Together, they forged a culture of absolute invincibility. They believed their enterprise moat was so deep that consumer trends could simply be ignored as frivolous distractions. That arrogance crystallized into a fatal blind spot in January 2007. When Apple unveiled the iPhone, the reaction in Waterloo, Ontario, was not panic, but engineering disdain. Lazaridis looked at the massive touchscreen and saw a battery-draining nightmare that would collapse any cellular network it touched. Balsillie saw a fragile consumer gadget that lacked enterprise-grade encryption. They dismissed the threat entirely, utterly failing to realize that the rules of their industry had just been rewritten overnight. The atmosphere inside the executive suite rapidly shifted from smug dismissal to defensive rationalization. The executives convinced themselves that no serious professional would ever type an email on a flat sheet of glass. They doubled down on their core demographic, assuming corporate executives would forever carry 2 devices, an iPhone for personal media and a BlackBerry for real work. The boardroom became an echo chamber, insulating itself against the reality that convenience was beginning to assassinate security. The fatal miscalculation was fundamentally misunderstanding who actually bought smartphones. For a decade, the IT manager held the purse strings, issuing standardized corporate hardware, but the iPhone sparked the bring-your-own-device revolution. Suddenly, managing directors and chief executives were walking into IT departments, slamming an Apple product on the desk and demanding it be connected to the corporate server. The purchasing power had violently shifted from the rigid network administrator to the status-obsessed end user. The enterprise fortress began to show deep structural fractures. AT&T had exclusive rights to the iPhone, which terrified Verizon. Desperate to stem the bleeding of their highest-paying subscribers, Verizon executives marched into Research in Motion headquarters and demanded an immediate touchscreen competitor. They did not want a keyboard. They wanted an iPhone killer, and they wanted it before the holiday shopping season. The carrier that Balsillie used to bully was now holding a gun to his head. This ultimatum birthed the BlackBerry Storm, a product that perfectly encapsulates the danger of reactive engineering. Instead of building a genuine multi-touch operating system from the ground up, Lazaridis and his team tried to hack a mechanical compromise. They engineered a touchscreen that literally clicked downward on a physical suspension system, attempting to simulate the tactile feedback of a traditional keyboard. It was a Frankenstein device, rushed through production to appease a telecom partner rather than delight a consumer. The launch was an unmitigated disaster. The Storm was sluggish, the click mechanism was prone to mechanical failure, and the software was riddled with catastrophic bugs. Customers returned the devices in droves, creating a logistical nightmare for Verizon retail stores. The internal panic was palpable. Engineers were working around the clock to patch a fundamentally broken architecture, But the damage to the brand's reputation for flawless reliability was already done. The invincible armor had been pierced. Verizon eventually demanded a staggering $500 million in compensation to cover the massive losses incurred by the storm's failure. This was a brutal financial hemorrhage, but the psychological toll was even worse. The company had just proven to the world and to themselves that they did not know how to build a modern consumer device. Yet instead of pivoting their core strategy, the leadership retreated back to the safety of their keyboards, hoping the touchscreen fad would simply burn out. While they licked their wounds, a second, equally lethal threat was quietly mobilizing. Google launched Android, offering a free, highly capable touchscreen operating system to any hardware manufacturer willing to use it. Now, Research in Motion was fighting a two-front war. Apple was capturing the premium market, and a flood of cheap Android devices was rapidly eroding the mid-tier consumer base. The competitive landscape had transformed into a software ecosystem battle, a war the Canadian company was entirely unequipped to fight. The true tragedy of this collapse is that they possessed a massive, unexploited weapon: BlackBerry Messenger. BBM was the original viral messaging network, a tightly closed ecosystem that kept millions of teenagers and executives locked into the hardware. Had they licensed BBM as a cross-platform application in 2009, they could have owned the global messaging infrastructure years before WhatsApp existed. But the board viewed BBM strictly as a hardware sales tool, refusing to decouple the software from the physical device. The internal culture devolved into a toxic stalemate. Factions formed between the old guard hardware purists who demanded loyalty to the QWERTY keyboard and younger software engineers begging for a modern, app-centric operating system. Development cycles stalled. Product roadmaps became convoluted messes of half-measures and compromised designs. The company was paralyzed by its own past success, terrified of alienating their legacy enterprise clients while simultaneously bleeding market share to competitors who were moving at the speed of software. The executive structure that once provided a perfect balance of engineering and business acumen now became a profound liability. Lazaridis and Balsillie were increasingly misaligned, unable to agree on a unified survival strategy. One wanted to double down on the proprietary network. The other wanted to aggressively pivot into new services. This executive gridlock meant that critical decisions were delayed for months, allowing Apple and Google to continuously widen their technological lead, while the former champion debated minor hardware tweaks. The financial metrics began to reflect the internal chaos. The company's market capitalization, once hovering near $80 billion, entered a terminal freefall. Institutional investors, finally waking up to the reality that the enterprise moat was an illusion, started dumping the stock. The quarterly earnings calls transformed from triumphant victory laps into defensive, hostile interrogations. The numbers told a story of a collapsing empire, even as the executives continued to project an aura of unearned confidence to the press. The definitive breaking point arrived in October 2011 with a catastrophic multi-day global network outage. For a company whose entire brand identity was built on unbreakable reliability and secure infrastructure, this was a fatal blow. Millions of users across 5 continents were left without email or messaging capabilities. The timing could not have been worse. It happened the exact same week Apple launched iMessage, handing disgruntled corporate clients the perfect excuse to finally sever their legacy contracts and migrate their fleets. The atmosphere of invincibility was entirely gone, replaced by the distinct stench of desperation. The board of directors, finally bowing to immense shareholder pressure, forced Lazaridis and Balsillie to step down in early 2012. The era of the founders was over. A new chief executive was installed with a single, brutal mandate: build a modern operating system from scratch and save the company from absolute liquidation. But the smartphone war was already over, and they were fighting over the ashes. The resulting product was BlackBerry 10, a completely redesigned operating system built on a modern microkernel architecture. It was objectively brilliant, featuring seamless multitasking and a fluid gesture-based interface that was years ahead of its time. But it arrived in 2013, completely devoid of the one thing that now mattered: an app ecosystem. Developers refused to waste resources coding for a dying platform with a microscopic user base. The hardware was beautiful, but the digital shelves were entirely empty. The launch was a multi-billion-dollar write-down waiting to happen. The company manufactured millions of new touchscreen devices, assuming the loyalists would return. They did not. The unsold inventory piled up in warehouses, forcing the company to take a massive nearly $1 billion charge for unsold phones. This was the final nail in the hardware coffin. The market share, which once stood at 50%, effectively evaporated to 0.0% in the span of a few brutal quarters. The hardware division was dead, but the corporate entity refused to file for bankruptcy. Instead, they executed one of the most painful, quiet pivots in modern business history. They abandoned the smartphone market entirely and retreated into the shadows of enterprise software and automotive security. The company that once defined mobile communication for the masses transformed into a faceless vendor of embedded systems and cybersecurity software, leveraging the only asset they had left, their reputation for encrypted data protection. Walking the halls of the company today is an exercise in corporate archaeology. The massive manufacturing facilities are gone. The global swagger has been replaced by the quiet, methodical hum of a niche software firm. They survived, but only by amputating the very limbs that made them famous. It is a profitable existence, but a deeply humbling one. They are no longer the kings of the boardroom. They are merely the silent security guards standing outside the door. The collapse of this mobile empire remains the ultimate case study in the innovator's dilemma. They did not fail because they built bad products. They failed because they continued to build the exact product their best customers asked for, right up until the moment those customers changed their minds. They optimized for a world that ceased to exist the moment a glass rectangle was unveiled in San Francisco. They protected their past at the direct expense of their future. In the high-stakes game of technology, monopolies are never assassinated by direct competitors. They are rendered irrelevant by paradigm shifts. Research in Motion thought they were in the business of secure corporate email. They failed to realize they were actually in the business of mobile computing. By the time they understood the difference, their empire had already been reduced to a cautionary tale, proving that in Silicon Valley, the most dangerous thing a dominant company can do is stand perfectly still.